Thank you very much indeed for the invitation. This is, I think, about the fourth time I've spoken to groups of BACP folk, but the last time was many, many years ago. How many of you have heard my spiel? Ah, great. So I can go over some slightly familiar ground. I'll explain a little bit more about my own background in a second, but when I was preparing this a few weeks ago, when I was asked by Meg, thank you very much, Meg, for the invitation, to come and speak to you, I was thinking in very sort of big, meaningful terms about the media. And I have big, meaningful thoughts about the media, some of which I'll share. But then when I was actually setting about doing the presentation, I took a closer look and thought, this is a very pompous title. And I put in your gubbins that you've got, I think there's this 3-point bullet list that you've got on the implications of modern media on the human psyche, individual and collective, on meaning making and the work of client healing, and on our own therapist's journey of encounter with the other. I mean, that's really impressive, don't you think? But then I thought, actually, why don't we have some fun? And I thought that probably what we could do, I actually wrote here, blimey, pretentious rubbish. All true, but let's make this fun and stimulating. In 2007, I did a presentation at the BACP conference, the big annual one in Birmingham. And I've used some of the ideas that I shared there. And I'd like to tell some personal stories as well, just a little bit about my own background, how I made the journey from correspondent, BBC and Reuters correspondent, through to psychotherapist. I mean, people say, wow, what a complete change of profession, but actually it's the same job because you sit down and listen to people and make up stories. If you see what I mean. So, I hate my notes. I'll do it this way. Okay. So a little bit about my background. I was that's me in younger days with not a lot more hair, in 1989 on Tiananmen Square in the run-up to the army's takeover of the center of Beijing. And with my usual journalistic foresight, I managed to leave Beijing 5 days before the tanks went in. And I would say that my introduction to conscious trauma was actually not being there on the Saturday. So I wasn't in Beijing when the biggest story of my life happened, and I'd been based there. I was passionate about China, and I was on the North Norfolk coast. And my wife said I literally went green when the news came in. I had a full-on physiological reaction to not being there. And we all know stories of clients who come to us not because they experienced the trauma in person, but because they weren't there when their mates were, or the other firefighters, or they weren't the one who fell out of the sky at Lockerbie, or survivor guilt and so on. So that was a huge trauma for me. But then later on I made up for it by going into Romania and being there. So I was one of them, I was a hack. And then I became one of these. So from the mid-90s, I retrained as a psychotherapist in transpersonal psychotherapy, qualified in 2000, so I don't put people on the couch any more than I suspect most of you don't either. So if I was then a shrink, I then became, I suppose, what you might call a hack plus a shrink, maybe a track. What I am also is a cyclotherapist, and I did smile because one of your colleagues came back to me and said, are you sure there's a spelling mistake on the third slide? If you go to cyclotherapist.com, my other passion, apart from working with individuals and making a difference about trauma, is cycling, and I do silly things like cycle to Budapest and back, and the South Island and New Zealand and so on. And my blog is full of crazy tales about going cycling. News. I think you'd probably recognize that scenario. We interrupt this emergency breaking news bulletin with an even scarier emergency breaking news bulletin. And another rather good cartoon I enjoy. Those are the headlines, and we'll be back in a moment to blow them out of proportion. This is my rant about news. I left news because I couldn't be done with it anymore. News is massively important for us. It is the news media, the media generally, are the forum through which we discover a reality that is beyond our immediate experience. If you think 3 levels of reality, there's our internal felt experience, conscious or unconscious. Then there's what we experience from our immediate environment, what people tell us, person to person. And then there's the outside world, which we get secondhand, vicarious news. And the media, of course, have changed the experience of that external world in the last few decades quite extraordinarily. If you think back to when we began this journey as Homo sapiens, well, not very sapiens, 200,000 years ago or so. The stories we heard were the stories of the clan, the stories of the group, were the tales handed down by word of mouth. And suddenly now, it is very sudden in evolutionary terms, we have access to every single thing that happens on the planet. And the problem is that we're still programmed with the instincts of a slightly more highly evolved ape. We're primarily about survival. As we know, our clients are in survival mode when they come to see us. And so we are interested primarily, viscerally, in anything that is relevant to our survival. So we like sugar, because there didn't used to be a lot of it about. We really like fat, because there might not be a slaughtered carcass for the next few days. We love salt. We would die without salt, which is why McDonald's and fast food and all the sugar that we get in our processed food is so incredibly successful, because we love it. It's about survival, except, of course, there's a surfeit of all of this, and we are in big trouble as a result, in health-wise. News is the same. Information is vital to our survival. Is that lion 300 yards over there about to attack? Is the neighbouring village about to come and chop our heads off, as even the peace-loving Yanomami Indians sort of used to go out and chop neighbours' heads off quite a lot. So there used to be a lot of violence around, and we need to know, am I under threat? Are my genes under threat? Are my children under threat? So we are tuned in. You know, the amygdala is busy listening all the time to threat. And the amygdala just loves fatty news. I call it muck news. And it's like fatty foods and fast food. We are now overindulged. We overindulge ourselves in information, most of which, doesn't help us manage our affairs on the planet. Now, this is human nature. Is it going to change? Probably not before climate change gets us. So we need to be realistic about what the nature of news and what can be changed. And of course, it has a big impact on our clients. It has a big impact on us. And I think we need to understand our clients and ourselves in this much wider framework of fear. How many of you read and enjoy genuinely, because you respect its opinions, the Daily Mail? A single hand goes up. The Daily Mail lives on fear. Its primary product is fear. It's all bad out there. You know, it's all somebody else's fault. And it appeals viscerally to our 200,000-year-old basic evolutionary survival self. And it's incredibly toxic. How many of you would agree that that kind of news agenda is very, very toxic? Okay, yeah, absolutely. Okay, so that's my sort of rant. You know, news, what is news? That was in South Wales, a horrible accident where somebody slipped on black ice and mowed down a whole pile of cyclists out. This, I think, was Syria. The tsunami, a father with his dead child's hand on the beach in Sri Lanka. Yazidi women. Bosnian rape survivor. East Ukraine. The Lufthansa flight, the German Wings flight flown into a mountain in the Alps. That awful killing of drummer Rigby in London. Need I say more? And Tunisia, just to take a few. This is the stuff of news. If you look at today's newspapers, listen to the BBC, it's about violence, it's about bad things that are happening, and we are drawn to it. You know, we want to know, but actually, do we need to know a lot of this? I'm not sure we do. And that's one of the reasons that after 25 years, well, 30 years in the news business, I got out and decided to. There's a lot of really good journalism around. Don't get me wrong. There's some fantastic journalists and journalism out there that do marvelous work. Lise Doucette from the BBC, Jeremy Bowen. I mean, I can think of dozens of colleagues who do fantastic work, and they really help us understand. But it needs to be understanding news, not just visceral muck news. And the McCanns, I remember Father McCann going to the courthouse in Portugal, past the sort of running the gauntlet of the media when they were being investigated as possible suspects in the disappearance of their daughter. And the one question that was broadcast on BBC News as the McCanns walked up to the door of the courthouse was, guess what? How do you feel, Mr. McCann? In my journalism training, I would tell journalists, never, ever, ever ask that question. Because it's voyeuristic, it doesn't help us understand. How do you think I'm feeling? There was an opportunity to change things. I had a huge amount of sympathy and support for all of the Hacked Off campaign, the victims of our tabloid media. Mike Jemson down in Bristol, I don't know if many of you have come across him media-wise, he's been banging on for about 20 years behind the scenes on behalf of people whose story has been told in the tabloid press, and they have been traduced. Their lives have been destroyed. There is no privacy, no respect. It's purely about selling violence, selling bad stories to the readership. And Leveson gave it a really good go. And I find it very sad, but perhaps not surprising, given how human beings manage their affairs. This is nothing very particular to our country. Very sad that so much of the media rounded against him. But pretty much everything he said and recommended, I thought was bang on. But we live in the real world, and it ain't going to change very fast. Mary Self was a very important person on my personal trauma journey. She was a teenage cancer survivor, and at the age of 17, she lost a leg to teenage bone cancer. She was told she would never have children. She survived. But she went on to train as a doctor and then a psychiatrist. She lives in South Wales in Cardiff. And to have two lovely children, to marry first and then have two lovely children. And then when she was 34, 17 years later, she had a relapse. She had a recurrence of the cancer and had terminal all over. And she was lined up for the hospice. She was talking to her children about the funeral, and she was in a very, very bad way. And then suddenly, some miracle, she is Christian. She thinks it's a bit to do with that. I have broader perspectives. We've had some very interesting discussions about evolution and the universe and energy and how healing happens. But she's written a very good book about this in 1999 called From Medicine to Miracle. And she's still going strong as a psychiatrist in Cardiff. And she was interviewed 100 times because it was a millennium story. Wow, miracle healing. She was all over the tabloids. And she says that half the journalists acted with incredible empathy and understanding. It worked both ways. I gave them a much better story. And likewise, she says she had a lot of bad interviews. In every case, a bad experience triggered re-traumatization through loss of trust and loss of control. So there you sort of have it, the survivor/victim experience of what it's like to be at the mercy of modern media. Now, this is personal. So I've done my rant. I can't change it. I love my colleagues. My master's thesis was on the personal experience of the foreign correspondent. I'll come to that in a moment. I follow the news. I read The Guardian. I occasionally look at the Daily Mail just to confirm my prejudices. I don't want to trash the media at all. But let me just get personal. This was 1974 in Moscow. It was my first foreign posting. I just want to prove that I really have been there and done it. This is on the exhibition of economic achievements in Moscow, VDNH, with a Vostok rocket behind there, and my goodness me, you can tell what decade it is, can't you, by my trousers and by my hair. Okay, so then this is one of my proudest experiences in my journalistic career. Andrei Dmitrievich Sakharov was very, very big in news terms while I was in Moscow, and that's me with hair at the back, interviewing him, and he's talking, and I used to go around and see him at least once a week for 2 years. And I tear up when I tell this story, so I'll just try and do it gracefully. When I left Moscow at the end of 1975, I went down to say goodbye to him. It was before he was sent out to exile in Gorky, before Perestroika and all the rest of it. So this was 1975, at the end of 75. And he was such a kind man. He was one of these men in whose presence you feel bigger. You just feel enhanced. I once interviewed the Dalai Lama and then cut out 130 ums from a 3.5-minute interview. because he giggled all the time. But I had that experience with the Dalai Lama. Some human beings, you sit with them and you just, oh, wow, you never forget the moment. Do your clients get that with you? I think probably they do, more than you realize. And he, as I left, he gave me a hug. And it was cheek to cheek, and I felt his stubble on my cheek. And it was the first time I'd ever been hugged by a man. It was amazing. And that sort of was the beginning of a journey of personal unfolding, I guess. Then we moved to East Berlin. I met my wife in Moscow. We lived in East Berlin for 2 years, 77, 78, and we had a tandem. We still do tandem. And that's us at Checkpoint Charlie. Coming through Checkpoint Charlie, we did have a laugh because the guards on Checkpoint Charlie in the middle of Berlin said, we're not sure whether we can let you through on a tandem, because if we do let you through on a tandem, we'll have to let somebody through on a horse tomorrow. You know, typical German non sequitur, but there we go. So that's just a close-up, just to prove it really is us. That's the bigger context of the photograph that I showed you at the beginning of me on Tiananmen Square. It's a publicity photograph, you know, I don't stand there. I did very little television. Lots of, I don't know, your generation, how many of you used to listen to me on Radio 4 from our own correspondent? Oh, wow. I went to give a talk to a bunch of bishops in Portsmouth at in, I don't know, 1990 or something, and I turned up, or 91, and I turned up at the meeting, and I went in, and I said, I'm Mark Brayne, and they said, what, the Mark Brayne? I didn't know, are there any others? I suppose so. Anyway, so I wasn't on television very much, but my picture would be shown in the corner, and lots of your generation, our generation, know me much more from a black and white picture in the top corner of the television screen. This is on Tiananmen Square at the height of the mess that the students created. It really was, it was mayhem. I could talk, you know, another subject about the politics and the psychology of that, what happened in Beijing, but it was very interesting. I got swept up in euphoria. I had a huge emotional response to what went on at Tiananmen Square. It was very, very exciting and liberating, and there was a massive thunderstorm, and I thought, oh my God, you know, the universe is speaking, and then the tanks went in. It turned out better here. This is Romania, that's Christmas Day, 1989. Ceausescu had gone. This is the National Library in the center of Bucharest, and the tanks at the back, and the army had switched sides. And there were bullets zinging about when I first got into Bucharest on the Saturday before Christmas. And that was an amazing story, a very powerful story. There's a personal story. I fell in love with a Hungarian girl on the train coming out of Bucharest on my way back to Budapest. And that just blew the lid on my whole issues, 40 years of repressed trauma, small t trauma from childhood. And should we say it changed my life? My wife wasn't very pleased. Yes, talking about love, this is on the Berlin Wall. This is actually Brezhnev and Honecker, the former East German leader, having a snog. I mean, there is actually a genuine photograph. They did that. This was, you know, socialist and communist leaders together. But the breakthrough, you know, the Trabi coming through the wall, this is one of my photographs. It is my photograph of a painting on the Berlin Wall after the wall came down. And it was a bit like that for me. It was my personal breakthrough as well. Something collapsed. I dreamt a lot at the time about East and West Berlin and huge buildings collapsing, big buildings of iron and steel collapsing. And I thought to myself, I think something's happening here. So news was reflecting itself in my internal world, my archetypal world, if you like. I became very interested in dreams at that time. Then, when my wife realized that there were things going on, we went into couple therapy, which was psychodynamic and useless. I'm sorry, we did 2 years of working with the transference. It was utterly, utterly counterproductive. It destroyed our marriage. To this day, I know some lovely psychoanalytic colleagues, and the lady we went to see is a lovely human being. I know she is, because I've heard it from other people, and I could sense her loveliness, but it didn't work. And surely the point of coming into psychotherapy is to feel better and to rescue, you know, to make relationships work where they're not working, if there's hope. And all we did is work out the frigging transference. So anyway, it's another story. But what happened after that is, that's my first and third wife there on our new tandem. We remarried 2 years ago. I have a second wife who's a bit miffed. Bit very miffed, actually. And Jutta and I, Jutta's German, we met in Moscow. There's a story attached to it, and I happily tell it to anybody at length who cares to know. We remarried almost exactly 2 years ago, November the 1st, and I said, will you marry me in April, 2.5 years ago, and she said yes on the top of Machu Picchu. That's what one does. Right, that's the personal. Right, I'm now going to introduce you, whether you like it or not, to the results of my thesis. It's a long time ago, and I haven't presented this actually in public since 2003, when it was a piece of research that was groundbreaking. There were very, very few people exploring the personal world of the journalist who covers trauma. I decided to do the master's thesis on the personal experience of the foreign correspondent at the CCPE. Anybody here from graduate CCPE? Centre for Counselling and Psychotherapy Education? Lovely. When I realised that rather than splitting off away from journalism, what I needed to do was to use my journalistic experience and integrate in a good old Jungian sense. So in the Mustakas sense, Clark Mustakas, whose books I loved on the heuristic research method. The question chooses you, you don't choose your research question. So the question just turned up one day and said, what I need to do clearly is explore the personal experience of my colleagues and my own experience from the perspective of a psychotherapeutic insight. And it was a fascinating experience. I spoke to, it was only a master's, so I only spoke to 9 others. And I spoke to myself actually at quite some length. And I found quite a lot of what I heard myself saying resonating with what some of my colleagues said, so that was quite reassuring. But in the year 2000, there was very little out there on journalists, on the emotional experience of the journalist. And I came to speak to you lot, or some of your predecessors at the BACP AGM in 2002, reflecting some of this, but not showing the slides, not showing my results. And there were sort of light bulbs were going on all over the place. And at that time, I just managed to cajole the BBC into setting up a trauma support program, trauma support and awareness program. I have a touch of Asperger's, as those of you who know me, it's been long evident to those living with me. But I only realized it the other day when I did an adult Asperger's test and came out at 36, which was quite interesting. My wife, Jutta, says the only reason she let me back is because she understood from her clients that Asperger's aren't actually, they don't mean it personally. The Aspies are doing their best, but they can really be very insensitive at times. So, in 2002, I managed to persuade the BBC, before I'd left the BBC on early retirement, to set up a program in the run-up to the Iraq War. And to their great credit, they said, do it, quick and dirty. So we got Neil Greenberg in from the military, who I'd met at an International Society for Traumatic Stress Studies conference in America. Because by then I'd also got in touch with an outfit called the DART Center for Journalism and Trauma. How many of you have heard of the DART Center? Oh, nothing like enough. Well, you've heard me before, so that doesn't count. It has nothing like the profile that it should, but the DART Center is so called because it runs off money from the DART Foundation, and the DART family, that's a family name, made their fortune in America from polystyrene coffee cups. So if you look at a polystyrene coffee cup, preferably when it's empty, turn it over and have a look at the top. There's an oval with DART written in it. And that's the company that made zillions from McFood, actually, from McDonald's, because everybody goes and buys their sugary, salty, fatty foods in polystyrene throwaway containers. So in a sense, there's a kind of an irony that the news element is now being addressed with money and profits from the DART Center. So they set up in the States a DART award for excellence in the coverage of victims of violence. And then they realized it's not just the victims, it's not just those who are being reported upon, it's also the journalists themselves. So what are we going to do for them? They're exposed, they're frontline responders. If there's a big bomb goes off half a mile down the road here, heaven forbid, which direction do most sensible people run? Who runs towards it? Well, it's the police, it's the firefighters, it's the medics, and it's the journalists. And more often than not, it's the journalists who get there first. And there was absolutely no awareness in the journalistic field of the impact of emotionally challenging, traumatic experiences on the individual psyche. No awareness. I went into Romania, I didn't have hostile environment training, I had no body armor, I was completely clueless about emotional well-being, utterly clueless, to the extent that I just probably a few weeks before I went out to Bucharest, I was at a party in North London. North London, I ask you, at a dinner party, and somebody said they were a psychotherapist. I think probably everybody there, apart from me, was a psychotherapist. And I said, what's one of those? Oh, blimey. So I went vulnerable, unprotected, emotionally, physically, and somehow managed to survive and actually did some of my best journalism. But it really woke me up. And then as I realized through my psychotherapy training, through the back end of the 90s, I was sort of really shocked at how little attention was being given in the news business to the vulnerable, soft side of the people who deliver the news. And at the same time, there was a movement to bring in hostile environment training at the BBC from 1995, extremely vigorously and determinedly pursued right from the top. So from 1995, every BBC journalist who goes to a nasty place has to have training for hostile environments. And there was just a quick mention, oh, by the way, you might get PTSD. It was better than nothing. And here's some basically good ideas, you know, drink lots of water, talk about it. But there wasn't anything structured. So in 2002, before the Iraq War, I said, we've got to do something structured. And I said at the time, it's going to take 10 years to shift the culture. And the fantastic thing, I'll come to it later, is that in the BBC, in Reuters, in National Public Radio, in Al Jazeera, in ITN, across the piece, I've done training with all of these folk, and they've all made it their own. So there's a huge amount of trauma awareness, and it's just part of the warp and the weft now of big news organizations, certainly in the Anglo-Saxon world, and in Germany. We did a lot of work in Germany. But it was shocking. So 2002, this was, you know, groundbreaking stuff. I should have written a book, but I hate writing. Bit of a bind when you're a journalist. So what did I find out? I found out, for example, that this slide thing is no longer working. Okay, go back to digital technology. Don't do this to me. Summary conclusions. I'm going to read some slides now fairly quickly. Sorry. Am I talking too fast? Are you with me? Is anybody bored? Because if so, please say so now. So, summary conclusions. Journalists' self-image, and the number of my colleagues who wouldn't put the apostrophe in the right place. By the way, the media, I hope nobody talks about the media is. Do any of you talk about the media is? Don't. It's the media are, it's plural. That's my ASPE. Journalist self-image, reporting facts soberly, dispassionately, and fairly. That's what my colleagues saw themselves as doing. Sober, dispassionate, and fairly. And they're motivated by, I found, a complex cocktail of personal ambition, damaged self-esteem, none of this will surprise you, childhood experiences, not always, addictive patterns, quite often, but also by passion and idealism. And almost all had had experiences of inspiration beyond the rational, particularly when covering a major story or up against a deadline. I found that fascinating. My questions in my master's thesis were about colleagues' experience of emotion, of tears, dreams, spirituality, and meaning. They were my sort of main headlines. And every single one of them, and there's lots of names in there that you'd know quite well, every single one said, do you know, nobody's ever asked me that. Simply, they'd never, ever been asked, and they all knew exactly what I was talking about, which was wonderful, actually. So why do we do it? We want to make sense. I'm giving you this partly because I'm quite pleased with the results that I got all those years ago and should have disseminated them much more widely, but also because you will get journalists coming to work with you. And I'm going to give you some tips and some do's and don'ts in a short while about how to work with them. And I hope that giving you an insight into their deeper level of experience might help you meet them at the deeper level that they need to be met at. So these are all quotes, because it was a qualitative research full of lots of lovely quotes. Why do we do it? We want to make sense. And it does give us a great feeling of satisfaction, like solving a complex mathematical problem. That was a bloke, you know. Very left brain analysis of actually what is a right brain experience. I'm interested in understanding what's happening, the bigger patterns, you know, making sense, narrative, creating, experiencing, fitting things together, seeking the truth. This is quite interesting. There is still this fantasy among many journalists that it's my job to report the truth. What is truth, I think, was once said some thousands of years ago. Truth is a very dangerous thing to think somehow I've got it. This is the truth. And journalists who have that need to be brought down a peg or two, and they usually are, sooner or later. And so one of my colleagues said, journalism is an instrument for giving people access to the truth. It's very clean, easy, and pure. Bless, bless. Worth doing through thick and thin. I've invested my soul. I ask you perhaps as you're listening to wonder, was this a bloke? Was this a lady? And you're right on those first two, your assumptions, and that's not just being sexist. You are, the CF, the therapist's role, this is my spin on this, you are the world's witness. From your reporting of that event comes the world's understanding of it. So you're sort of therapist to the planet, you're therapist to your audience. Just like we witness our clients' stories, we feel, we experience, we intuit, we build, we explore with our clients. What is their truth? What is their very personal truth? And their complexity, their ambivalence around truth. And then we reflect back to them what we facilitate their understanding of the truth and the connections perhaps that we experience before they're able to. We hold that until they're able to take it back. So very similar to what we do with in journalism. Personal growth, I think I want to clarify for myself and thereby clarify for others. Personal development, it's part of the business of learning and developing and being able to say to yourself, I didn't used to be able to do that. That's a buzz. It's a bit like, oh, what has not been mentioned yet, by the way, I ought to put a very, very big flag up saying EMDR. I am nuts. Where's Derek? Where's Derek? Where's my good friend Derek? I am completely nuts about EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. It is amazing. I'm a consultant. I live, breathe, dream EMDR. My wife is also an EMDR practitioner. Guess what we talk about? There we go. It brought us back together again, actually. And Derek is a very big wig in the EMDR field and runs an MSc in EMDR at the University of Worcester. And he's a pioneer. Good man. Good work. We had slightly too much wine last night, but that's another story. The desire to be seen. Stories are a vehicle for achievement and recognition. A story might be significant to me only in as much as it's enabled me to get on air. I remember who said that. And that was a true reflection of this chap, bless him. I asked him about this chap, I asked him, you know, what do you find most traumatic? And he said, that I'm not covering the story in wherever it was at that moment. You know, bloody BBC haven't sent me. I don't particularly care about the story's global significance. I care about their significance to me. That is my career and my family. Honest answer. But don't assume that everybody's like that. I suppose I see them as commodities, in a way, stories. Interesting. Ego and the addictive buzz. A need to achieve, a need to have that recognized by others. The buzz from danger, mental stimulation. You want the hint, the frigging hit, and the excitement and the buzz, but only the addict in you needs it. AAA, alcohol, adrenaline, approbation. There's nothing like a firefight to take you out of yourself. Identity. Maybe I'm not quite sure who I am. In some ways, I'm a bit lost. To an extent, the job is a crucial part of my identity, my persona. Looking back with the perspective of a lot of psychotherapy, I know that I went into journalism to find meaning and to heal the divisions in my family and my own heart. And that was why I was drawn to the communist world. So spending a long time in the communist world And Berlin was a kind of metaphor for my own internal experience. And then it got acted out in my family, with my wife. So it's all quite interesting how it all joins up. Perhaps this whole journey has been a proof to me that I do exist. It's a search for myself. I love that quote. You know, how many of you are existential? Well, we all are, but yeah, you'll recognize that. The experience of emotion. I don't believe it's good to show one's own emotion in reporting a story. I think that my job is to report other people's emotion, which is true. And if you're not emotional, you will not be able to tell the story. There's a very famous BBC journalist who covered the Dunblane killings. And this journalist, whose gender I won't name, was pulled off the story halfway through the day because the audience was simply not resonating. All the facts were there, but it just didn't fly. ITN creamed the BBC with Dunblane reporting because their reporter felt the story and you could feel his feelings. The story wasn't about his feelings, but he was the medium, the feeling medium between the events and the audience. Halabja, Iraq, personal feelings subsumed into professional feelings. That was the Saddam Hussein's chemical attacks on the Kurds. Journalists suppress feelings by converting them into journalistic energy. Sort of true. When you're seeking something ghastly, you're thinking in our sick sort of way, God, this is brilliant pictures, this is brilliant story. At the World Service, where I was European news editor, I'm working with the language services, with the output of the European language services for 10 years. Once I came off the road in 1992, our morning editorial meeting would start with this kind of ghoulish, great story, lots of people dead. There was a period in World Service News where Sri Lanka was a major, major, major story. It was a big story, but the reason it was a big story in the World Service News bulletins was that a lot of people were getting killed. You measure the impact of a story by the amount of blood in it. If it bleeds, it leads. That's not good. That's not good. I'm sometimes moved, but to be honest, I'm busy getting the story and worrying about the logistics and getting better pictures. I'm very third person. I don't personally engage. I'm not the person in the story. I'm the person outside watching it. Distancing. A bit like a film set. 99% of the time that's fine, but there's the contradiction. The better the film set, the more chance it is that you'll be embroiled in it. You feel like you're distant from it, and yet you're involved. Interesting language, all this you stuff. You know, we pick up our clients on that, don't we? Rwanda, I didn't want to be interrupted. I didn't want to stop, because once you start stopping, then you never stop stopping. So this kind of momentum being propelled forward. Flow, Csikszentmihalyi, wonderful Hungarian name, who's written about flow. I just love that. And we have experience of flow with our clients, don't we? There's just no question. You know, wow. Think afterwards, there's something just bigger than us that's happening. We're in touch with something. Tiananmen Square, I was watching the story write itself on my laptop screen, thinking, well, this is weird. This is weird. Blimey. Woo, that's good. We were the first outside journalists to be there, and there was pressure. I felt somehow the event itself flowed through me onto the page. I feel like if I feel I'm writing well, it just comes out. You know, it's sort of, I feel, where did that come from? And I'm sometimes slightly surprised or even amazed that I can just put it together. We tune into something, it's a little bit scary sometimes. I suppose when it's at its best, it's just sort of coming out, really. You're not very conscious, just a sort of funnel, really. The ego disappears because you're just the pure messenger and you're a vessel. And so your own doubts and ego are no longer in the way. At those moments, the self retreats and you're like a clear pane of glass between one thing and another. It just goes through like surfing a wave. You're so aware and thinking so clearly and so fast. I love this because that was my experience on a big story. It really, you were just all lifted to a sort of higher plane. You've got to be so careful not to lose contact. You've got to stay grounded. And yet this stuff is not talked about in journalism. I hope it is more now. Because this is what we do. We stick pieces together. You know, we assemble jigsaws. People come to us as victims, survivors of stories, subjects of the news, and they are fragmented. The story is fragmented. You get this bit from this person, you get that bit from that person. We stick together, we get a sense of coherence. And if we as a journalist are blocked in our own ability to experience uncertainty, if we've just got blinkers on and we're just looking for the truth, we'll not tell a good story. If we can sit with, dance with the ambiguities of reality, we're much likely to be a better journalist, just like we're much likely to be a better therapist. So a bit about technology. I was in northwest China there, Graham Earnshaw from Reuters on the right. And the technology, of course, has changed dramatically. I just wanted to remind us all of how much has changed since I was a journalist in the field. I had a cassette recorder and very, very heavyweight stuff. I mean, I did do a lot of filming in Tibet just for fun, and that was the world's first handycam, the first one-piece consumer video recorder that came out. And look at the size of the thing. So I was in Tibet, and if anybody's interested, this was in 1985, if anybody's interested in my reporting from China, on my blog, I've got all my old pieces up there in sound form. So cyclotherapist.com. And some of them, the pieces, the bits before they were mixed in the studio in London. And I've just put them up there for journalism students to hear how one journalist in an earlier time stuck stuff together. Anthony Feinstein is a psychiatrist from Canada, and he conducted the very first serious study of war journalists, of journalists who cover really, really big, bad stories. And his conclusions were enormously important in research. Derek and I were talking about the importance of research yesterday. This is what shifted the culture. This is where journalists and their managers and their news organizations says, oh dear, we got to do something about this. This is not just nice to have, this is mission critical. So Anthony put together, he'd interviewed 135 frontline journalists and did in-depth interviews with about 25 of them. And the war journalists were average age 39, control journalists, he had a control grouping of domestic journalists in Canada, gender, mainly male, 78, 71, marital. Interesting, the war journalists were more married than less. Most of them single divorced versus married. Look at the difference, 54% married, single divorced versus 46% married. And among the control journalists, not covering big foreign stories, 35% single, 64% married. Years as a journalist, around 15. Stories they covered, mostly Bosnia, Croatia, Serbia, Kosovo, Gulf War, Rwanda, Burundi, Congo, Zaire, Chechnya, Somalia, Middle East, Lebanon, Sierra Leone, Afghanistan. So there was a lot of Bosnia experience from the early 90s in here. So using the impact of event scale, the war journalists had very significantly higher levels of intrusion. So this was just a snapshot study at a particular time. And 9.2 versus 4.3%. Derek, you have to explain to me sometime what this 0.0001 in terms of significance mean. I've never got my head around that, but those of you who do research will know that that's pretty important. Avoidance, massively more, 6.7 against 3.1. Arousal, 4.7 against 2. So 20 versus 9. I mean, very, very significantly, statistically hugely significant, higher incidence of traumatic stress symptoms among war journalists. Depression scores, 10 on the Beck Depression Inventory as opposed to 6.4. Let me just go through this lot. That's probably enough. Just to say, journalists who cover big stories go through pretty interesting times, but don't think, and I've had to educate the journalistic world very strongly on this, that because I don't cover war abroad, I'm not experiencing trauma. Because the trauma that most journalists bring, the one that really knocked them, was death knocks. Going to knock on Mrs. Smith's door to say, your son has just been knifed in a gang fracas in South London. How do you feel? Have you got a nice photograph? And it sits with the journalists for years afterwards. And covering road accidents, very often the journalists would be there and they'd be looking at mangled wrecks, really horrible stuff. So it's not just the big foreign stuff, it's very much the local stuff. The Dart Centre, this is the recent front page from the Dart Centre, dartcentre.org, with lots of good background on there. And that's Mark Byford, really irritated with me, for having forced him, former Deputy Director General of the BBC, for having forced him to introduce this trauma support programme, but he actually came on side and became a real champion. This is at the Frontline Club, with Dart Awards being given out in 2006, I think. And this, if you go on the BBC Academy website, Sian Williams has done a very, very good presentation of journalism and trauma, which is accessible to the public. So lots of journalists talking about their experience of PTSD and trauma and covering a whole range of stories. That's the, I'll leave this lot. This was I don't know if any of you saw and we're nearly there, by the way, you can coffee your weight second. This was a cartoon that was done for Therapy Today in 2002, when I had said at the AGM that all too many journalists use Johnny Walker as their counsellor. So there you go. What works? If journalists come to you, don't just listen. Get in there. The simply person-centered approach does not work with journalists. I personally, I think it's a wonderful base, and there are some wonderful person-centered therapists out there. But journalists expect you to get active. And if you're not, they'll walk. They won't stay with you. Trauma-focused. EMDR, CBT. EMDR is much, much better than CBT, but get me going on that. Psychoeducation. Journalists, people who come in, they need to be told what's happening to them. A journalist once wrote me a long email saying, I'm having these terrible symptoms, I don't know what it means, I leap out of my seat when my son says boo, I can't pack my stuff, I'm missing deadlines, I can't sleep, I keep having nightmares, and I don't know what's happening. I said, well, welcome to the human race. And I took him through PTSD and normal responses. I could feel the weight falling off. He said, oh my God, you mean I'm normal? So psychoeducation, and Matt McAllister wrote a lovely book called Bittersweet. He came in feeling really bad. He thought he had PTSD, and we went through his symptoms, and it didn't sound like PTSD. And after half an hour, I said, Matt, I don't think it's PTSD. Is anything else happening in your life? He said, well, I don't know whether it's relevant, but my mother died 10 days ago. So the next half hour, it was all about bereavement. He went away. I never saw him again. He went away, and 3 years later sent me an email saying, hope you don't mind, I've written a book about you. Well, it triggered his journey to discover his mother, who'd had bipolar and been in and out of institutions. It was really, really not well. But she cooked fantastically. And so he explored his mother's recipes. So the book, Bittersweet, is about his journalistic journey, his mother, this crazy character who did this wonderful cooking, and his wife's and his attempts to have a baby, which was very traumatic. This is going to be my last slide. In the swamp, it's not the alligators that get you, but the mosquitoes. Small t trauma. Be proactive, solution-oriented, problem-solving. Too many journalists have come to me with bad experiences of counselling. I am passionate. This is what happens when I talk about EMDR. I tend to self-combust. That was a photograph of me halfway through a presentation on EMDR to our regional EMDR group in Norwich. And EMDR refreshes the parts other therapies cannot reach. This is a little bit of Photoshop in there. And it heals. This work, good journalism, good therapy heals. That's what Berlin used to look like. That's the same spot now. And that's what goes on in our clients' psyches, I think. Reconstruction. Big one coming. We've got a lot of trauma coming. Climate change, sustainability. Oh boy. I just parked that thought. And I did an article for Therapy Today in 2007. Some of you may have read it. And it doesn't look any better now than it did then. Thank you very much.